may I now introduce Hannah Pallubinsky, who's going to give us a really innovative talk, I hope, on humans and buildings in the time of climate change. Hannah is just taking up her new post in Maastricht again. So welcome, Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for the kind introduction and for making it possible for me to speak this morning and tell you a little bit about a vision that we have developed in Maastricht over the past years, and done also some research to support some of the things that we are trying to get across. So I don't really need to talk about this much because Alan has already told us how bad it might become. But I just found this study very interesting. It's a projection of what the climate in certain cities might become towards the year 2050 if we go with this RCPE 4.5 scenario. And yeah, Edinburgh is turning into Paris. So the climate will shift south about 900 kilometers, and particularly the extreme months or the warmest month will become extremer and extremer. So this as a little notion. And we already know that the heat that we are going to have can be very dangerous. And we already seen that in 2003 in this very extreme heat wave in France with a lot of excess deaths, and a majority of the victims were slightly older, above 65, and a lot of those were female, and many were dying at home and in care facilities, of course, very sad. And we see that this is repeating more frequently, particularly in the past years. We've seen 3 subsequent summer heat waves in 2018 to 2020, again with a lot of excess deaths. And again, this year, another heat wave. So we see that it's getting more and more frequent, and we need to act on this pretty quickly. And just to talk a little bit about what actually happens in the heat to the human body. So what happens is we get an increased blood flow to the skin and less blood to organs. And then we lose water and salt because we are sweating. So these are kind of normal mechanisms that we have in the heat to kind of cool our body down. But when the climate is very extreme that we are in, and we don't have enough water to sweat anymore, especially then the body temperature will rise and blood will become more viscous, and there will be an overload of the heart. Again, particularly with pre-existing conditions of the heart, it can be very dangerous. There will be insufficient oxygen for brain and other organs, and also an inflammatory reaction, which is due to the gut actually becoming leaky. And this all is life-threatening. So, of course, we need to take actions to prevent that. And you probably recognize something like this that we've seen over and over again in summer, particularly when we know there's a heat wave coming. This is kind of advertised everywhere in places. So, like the acute measures that we can take to prevent the heat from affecting us too much. Of course, we all know these things. It's very logical to drink water, to kind of seek shade and avoid the direct sun radiation, to stay cool by dressing down, using fans, etc., etc. So these are mostly acute measures that we can take. Oh, just to spoiler, I think that we need to add something to this kind of a scheme here, but I will come back to this later. So what now? We would not attempt to run a marathon without any training for it. So yeah, we need to maybe look at it also as if it was a marathon, this climate change that we are in. And the facts are, it is progressing fast. The heat waves are becoming more and more frequent, and we need to kind of live with this new normal. We need to find ways of actually going beyond these acute measures that I just showed to be able to plan for it and really, maybe do something more. And for that, old habits may need to be reconsidered. So we may need to change a little bit for that. Looking at the current practice in a lot of indoor spaces, And I know, of course, there's a lot of indoor spaces that look very differently, and I want to kind of focus on the Western developed industrialized areas when I'm making my statements today. So please, think about that. And what we see is often that indoor environments like this nice hall, we can heat, we can cool, we can dry, we can humidify, we can move air. So basically, we are completely independent from what is going on outside. And this is, of course, to create a uniform environment, a neutral and comfortable space. And if that's going to be the way of the future, I will talk about this, of course, more. And so this comfort, like, why are we so crazy about it? Why do we want to be in comfort all the time? It is in our genes, I can tell you. Of course, already 500,000 years ago, people were building the first shelters. And why did they do that? Well, to seek protection from weather, to seek protection from predators, and probably there were many other reasons. But in the end, it would help them to survive. So we have this natural desire, this natural striving to seek comfort because it will help us survive, it will ensure our survival, and it also helps us to save precious energy for thermoregulation, so we don't have to spend as much energy to keep us warm or to keep us cool in terms of water resources. So it's natural to seek for comfort. Oops. Yes, but is it still, like, do we still have to have this constant looking for comfort today? Because we have all the comfort around us, and it is certainly at this moment no longer about survival when we say, oh, it's a little bit cold, maybe I should turn on the heating. And we even have the predators in our house now, so we know it's not any longer about survival. But still, we think comfort, that surely means health. So being comfortable all the time must mean that we are very healthy. And we know that from other departments, I would call it so, like physical activity and nutrition, that being comfortable all the time doesn't necessarily mean that you're also healthy. So we cannot eat pizza all the time just we think it's comfort food. We cannot lie on the couch all the time because it's comfortable. We know that already. That it's not healthy. So maybe the same is also applicable for temperature. And actually, there are a few studies out there that kind of make this suggestion, and we've also written one of it together with my colleague Berta, that actually spending time in the comfort zone all the time, in the thermal comfort zone, may not be healthy and may even lead to some conditions like obesity or metabolic problems in the body. So back to this issue at hand, is there a way to train for this marathon and to plan for the marathon a little bit more that we are facing, the climate challenge that we're facing? I want to talk a little bit about heat acclimation, because heat acclimation is something that has been looked at a lot in the literature, particularly for target groups such as military and sports athletes, etc., because they need to perform well sometimes in extreme heat. And there have been a lot of studies looking at how they can increase or improve the performance in the heat. So, for example, looking at this study here, it's just a small example of the parameter heart rate here on the y-axis and the time on the x-axis. So before acclimation, this gray curve here, you see that heart rate goes up very quickly and it comes to exhaustion of the person that's trying to do some exercise here. I don't know what the activity is, but, well, this is coming to exhaustion very quickly. And after acclimation, so after training in the heat for some time, you see that this person can actually perform longer, and also the heart rate doesn't go up this fast as before. And actually, there are quite a few other parameters that adapt to heat if you just exercise it. So if you really plan and have like an acclimation program that you follow. So we have heart rate here, again, a quite steep decrease, and after about 6 days of acclimation, it kind of plateaus. There's also another important factor in green here, which is core temperature. It goes down. with several days of exercising in the heat. And that means that the body is creating a type of buffer that prevents from overheating too fast. We also see, very interesting probably for this audience, that thermal comfort is improving after several days of getting used to the heat, and so are several other parameters in the body. However, you may ask yourself, do I really have to exercise in the heat then to get acclimatized, to make my body cope better with the heat? So what about everyday life? Just sitting in your office during a heat wave and you're wondering, okay, now I'm sitting here, it's above 30 degrees, is it going to get any better for me? Can I actually get acclimatized while resting in the heat? And we wanted to look at that in Maastricht, so we have put together 2 studies to look at passive heat acclimation without the additional element of exercise in 2 different groups. So this is 2 studies that I'm trying to summarize. We looked at 11 young and normal weight men and 11 middle-aged and overweight men, and we performed this heat acclimation protocol with them. Between 7 to 10 days of acclimation, they would come to our lab every day, and then they would be in a warm room of approximately 35 degrees Celsius for 4 to 6 hours a day, and they were doing office work. And then before and after acclimation, we would do a heat stress test to see if the physiology has changed over the time. And we also looked at certain metabolic aspects in the older group, because there it is particularly interesting. Here are some impressions. So this person here is sitting in our lab during the acclimation. So this is the kind of the setting that they were doing their office work in. And this is during the heat stress test in our lab as well. And you can see we've done a lot of different measurements: skin temperature, blood pressure. We've measured core temperature as well, energy expenditure, etc., etc. Just to summarize some of the results, we have seen that also after passive acclimation, without doing any exercise in the heat, you see a decrease of core temperature. So this is during the heat stress test, and these gray squares show that every time point we measured was lower than before acclimation. We see improved heat dissipation through the skin, so the body can lose more heat more easily via the skin, via higher blood perfusion. We see more efficient sweating, a lowering of heart rate, a lowering of blood pressure. And so this is really a nice thing to see, because we know now that we can basically get acclimatized without exercising for it in a passive way, just being exposed to heat regularly. So also we looked at metabolic health, and after the acclimation, we saw that in the older population with overweight, there was a decrease in glucose and insulin in the plasma, and also a decrease of liver glucose production. So the liver itself was making less glucose, which is really positive, because in this type of population, older age and overweight, you have a risk factor of diabetes. And also we see that the cholesterol and free fatty acids in plasma were decreasing, and more fat was being burned as well. So again, a very positive thing, because this really shows that after heat acclimation, this group had an improved metabolic profile. So good news, we don't need to train for a marathon to get used to heat, but regular exposure is really what we need. And we see that regular exposure to heat will improve the physiological response, will actually make you more resilient to heat and better tolerate it. And on top of that, it can even induce positive effects for your health. And this, in turn, again, thinking about all these like life-threatening points in the cascade of what happens in the heat, can actually decrease the risk for these heat-related illness. Other studies, not the ones that we did, but other studies also show that there's behavioral adaptation taking place, and also the thermal perception will change. So with heat acclimation, you will feel better in the heat as well. And even more good news, because tomorrow Wouter van Marken-Lichtenberg will talk about cold acclimation, and also there we see similar things. So this is not just true for the heat, also for the cold. And this really shows the body is adapting to whatever it's being exposed to whatever the challenge is. Of course, within limits, but there is this opportunity. And also we see this in both groups, in the younger group and in the older group. So, of course, there are more populations that need to be looked at, but it kind of gives an indication that it's, you know, not just young, fit, healthy people that can adapt. And yes, this really, again, to say that there is individual differences in terms of how well acclimation or acclimatization can work. And of course, it's not only about the physiology of the body, but also about behavior and the situation that you find yourself in. Because you can imagine when COVID first hit, those healthcare workers that suddenly needed to wear extreme equipment to protect themselves from the virus, they were less able to adapt. And from one day to the next, they had to wear these heavy things, and it was very difficult for them to work. And of course, after some time, there will be some adaptation to that as well. But of course, always within limits. So I already spoiled a little bit, and this is actually what I would like to add to this kind of scheme, is really to go with the seasons, get acclimatized, and help your body to work better in the heat, to be able to reduce the risk for heat illness. It will really help. Now towards the role of the indoor environment. And we already now have established that exposure is key. So how can this be translated into the indoor environment? And maybe some of you know it better than we do, but we think that we need to go away from this uniform and neutral and comfortable indoor environment towards a more dynamic indoor climate that allows for daily and also seasonal fluctuations based on what's going on outside. Because this has also very many positive effects as well. It can save energy and money and CO2. And there is a potential for higher energy flexibility, which is also kind of increasing the resilience of the building itself. And as I already said, we have a potential to stimulate the thermoregulatory system of the body and get acclimation going. And we can even have some improved health. And then, of course, everybody is yelling, yeah, but what about productivity? Because in an office environment, of course, bosses want to ensure that people are still as productive as before. And José Porras Salazar has done this nice meta-analysis also together with Stefano, who's here today. And they did not find in this meta-analysis any relationship between indoor temperature and office work. So please don't shoot me for saying this. If there are any questions, I already discussed with Stefano. He will be happy to talk about it more. So how can we introduce a dynamic indoor environment to the situation that we have today? And here are some ideas. Maybe you have more ideas. So of course, we already have the adaptive comfort model that allows for more seasonal variation, but so far only if I'm informed correctly, only recommended for naturally ventilated buildings. So this can also be extended to other types of buildings. Then we can have a larger diurnal variation, so over the day, which is kind of also the natural, or kind of a mirror of the natural thing that's going on outside. In the morning, somewhat cooler, temperature rises towards the late afternoon and drops again towards the night. And my colleague, Joanna Ivanova, former colleague, has done the study and looked at thermal sensation and thermal comfort during either a stable temperature or so this was the stable temperature or this drift. And she found that actually people were feeling quite well. They reported feeling either slightly cold or slightly warm, which is a very acceptable range. And 75% of them even had a wider comfort zone in this drift compared with the stable temperature. Another colleague of mine, Wei Luo, is doing a lot of work on comfort systems. And introducing comfort systems as an additional measure would even allow for more drift, for more dynamics maybe in the indoor environment, while keeping a microclimate that is acceptable for the individual. And he even shows in his study that there may be the possibility for retained health effects. But of course, we still need to look at this a bit more and also on a longer term, because this was a study that was not an acclimation protocol or anything. And yeah, maybe you have more ideas how to get to this. So to wrap it up, we think that we need to move away from strict regulation of the indoor climate towards more natural, more dynamic, more fluctuation in the indoor environment, because this has a multitude of benefits. We see that it's a kind of temperature training for the human being and making us more resilient towards heat or even cold as well. There's a big potential for health effects. We can save energy, money, CO2, higher energy flexibility possible, and all of that with retained satisfaction and comfort and possibly also productivity. So yeah, overall, we think that this is the way to go in the future. I don't want to leave this podium without telling you about the Healthy Buildings 2023 that will take place in my hometown in Aachen. If you would like to come to this conference, it would be really nice to see a lot of your faces there. And the deadline for abstract submission is coming close, so if you want to submit before the 15th of September, that would be great. I hope you can all use this QR code. I see some phones up. And of course, with that, I would like to thank you very much for the attention, and also thank my co-authors and colleagues Wouter and Rick, who helped me in developing this vision and the paper and the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That was extremely interesting there. Now, perhaps as we're going to have questions, maybe Roger, you'd like to come up, and Alan, come down, and we can field some questions across the board, because you know a lot of this is going to be fairly new. Now, if you're asking questions, could you come to this microphone at the front? Or there's one on the wall there and one on the wall there. Now, would anybody like to ask some questions of any of the speakers here? Okay. Catherine Noakes.
So I have a question for Alan, because you talked about. I start to make it work. There we go. You talked about the probability that we might see 40 degrees or 43 degrees as, perhaps once a decade or something. But where are we with the slightly lower temperatures? Because I think when we're talking about designing buildings, we're probably not going to design for 43, but we might need to now start designing for 33 rather than 28 or something. And do you have any idea about the probability that we're going to see more extreme temperatures than we're seeing now at a greater frequency?
That is, a really good question. I suppose the question, I'd want to explore a bit more, dig into that question, but is it a building in general designed for summer temperatures, or, if you say 28 degrees, maybe what you're aiming for, what does that actually mean in the kind of present or recent historic climate? Definitely we can look at how that point of the kind of distribution of temperature shifts in the future. But yeah, I suppose it depends a little bit. Is that just middle of the average summer temperatures, or is that already quite extreme for a summer or not? So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a precise number, but yeah, it's something we could definitely do.
I think it's just probabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have seen when we looked at that sort of question is that, at least for the UK, the general kind of distribution of temperatures, which is roughly normal, stays quite like that. There's not suddenly there's a big skew in the distribution. The whole thing is kind of shifting. So yeah.
I suppose that raises the issue of, people are comfortable with the idea of risk. But are we moving into an age in which we're dealing with uncertainty? And how do you design for uncertainty too?
I think we have to accept more uncertainty, and a bit like in my world, sometimes collections, the care of objects and collections the conditions have been narrowed down to a very narrow margin, and that's kind of fine, but it's very expensive to achieve that certainty, that absolute certainty of temperature and relative humidity. And I'd suggest that the same applies in an office environment, let's say, where the client who takes on the lease or the user of the building has to accept that, as was mentioned, that a couple of days a year it may be a bit hot, but actually if we have a resilient building, you do more windows, or you do more X or more Y. You have a building that has a wider number of levers that you can, not necessarily physically, but metaphorical levers to deal with the conditions you're hoping to expect.
Yes, do come down to the microphone.
You mentioned that, is it on now?
I think so.
You mentioned that it doesn't matter the climate regarding working capacity.
Sorry, can you repeat
The
that?
working capacity, the working results did not really had the climate was not so important for that. It was what you concluded.
I'm really sorry. It was
The productivity did not have any effect, even if the temperature was too high. Was that the result of your research?
well, that was not the result of my research. I think Stefano can talk about this a bit more because they have done this meta-analysis of studies looking at how the work or the temperature in the indoor environment affects the work productivity. And there was no relationship found in this meta-analysis, right, Stefano?
Okay, and how many people was included in this experiment?
I
Because
think it was a meta-analysis, so it was a huge review of a lot of studies that had taken place.
okay, because you really need to have a lot of people included if you should show a statistical difference.
Maybe Stefano.
Okay, yeah, you can come.
So we have Stefano and then Piano. You kind of that, and then I think that was some coffee.
It would take some time to summarize the study, but overall, we didn't prove that the thermal environment does not affect work performance. We proved that we don't have a way right now to put the data together and build a reliable equation that's determined which is the comfortable or the most productive condition, at least if you are within a reasonable range of temperature. When this within a reasonable range is something between 18 and 30 degrees, still we were not be able to detect an effect. When we put the data together, there were several effects when the single study looked at it.
So if anybody's interested in finding out more, talk to Stefano and Piano.
Yeah, I will be very happy.
Yes, Bjarne Olesen, DTU. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow.
Good.
On productivity, and there is an effect, and there's so many studies showing that. I just want to come back to the training for the marathon. I don't think you should do it during your working hours. You should do it in your spare time. If you want to have imposed changes of the indoor environment on people while they're working, they don't accept that. They don't like that. If they do it themselves, if they decide when to open window and when to do exercise, that's fine. So you can explain them, but don't have system or others suddenly change the environment to train for the marathon. We do that outside our working hours.
Okay, if you allow me to just respond to that very quickly, because you just mentioned it yourself. You said a sudden change of the indoor environment, and of course that's not what we suggest. We suggest that we should look at increasing the flexibility and increasing the dynamics within the indoor environment, but not from one day to the next, but slowly in a transition phase from not just now to then, but also from spring to summer and back to winter. And it's all kind of more about a slow transition. And of course, I'm not saying people should train for a marathon during their work, but if they are already accustomed to a certain range of temperatures, that is maybe higher than the 21 standard inside, but maybe in summer it's 25 or 27, then this can be very acceptable. with some, maybe additions of personal comfort systems, fans, increased ventilation, etc. It can be completely neutral for them then, even. And I think we need to look at that more, and also more on a long-term scale.
Right. Well, is this a good point? We like a bit of contention here. Good point to go and have coffee, and we can take that up. And we look forward to your talk tomorrow, Bjarne. Thank you very much to our speakers.